Hey everyone, Michael Park here for CreativeCow.net, and in today's tutorial we're going to look at how to recreate the famous title intro sequence from a movie which cannot be named. You can probably figure it out though. Anyway, one quick thing before we start. The project file that is at CreativeCow.net contains all the textures we'll be using today, as well as two separate fonts that you may not have installed on your computer at present, Harry P and Lumos. You can either download those from the internet, which I did, they're free, or you can simply grab them from the project file because they're all zipped up together along with all of the textures we'll be using today. So anyway, grab that project file, install the fonts, fire up After Effects, and let's get started. The first thing we need to do is start a new composition. So from the menu, choose Composition, New Composition, or hit Control-N, and let's name this Final Comp. I'm using the 720p 25 frames per second preset, duration of 10 seconds, and click OK. The first thing I actually want to do is set up my camera move, but in order to see what that's doing, we need a texture in the background so we can see, zooming in, zooming out, and what the effect of that camera move is. So let's go ahead and import all of our textures. So in the project window, double click, and we'll grab all the textures in here and choose Open. Let's go ahead and put them in a separate folder to keep things nice and tidy. Call these Texture Assets. And let's put all of our textures into that folder, twirl it down, grab the Clouds BG layer and drag it on the timeline and make it a 3D layer. Next, let's put our camera in. From the menu, select Layer, New, Camera, make it a 24mm preset, choose OK. I'm going to be using a Null Object to animate my camera, so let's go ahead and put one of those in. From the menu, choose Layer, New, Null Object. Let's make it a 3D layer. Let's parent our camera to it, and let's rename the Null Object Camera Move. There we go. With the camera move layer selected, choose P and set a keyframe, making sure you're on the first frame here. Set a keyframe for the position, and I'm going to scrub this forward maybe to about 500, and then I'm going to scrub all the way to the end of the timeline and move this back. If you hold shift and move it, it'll do it a lot faster. I'm going to go back to minus 1,000 or so, and if we look at the camera move, it zooms out. Let's easy ease this by selecting both keyframes and hitting F9, or you can use the right menu and choose Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease. Now we have a nice smooth movement, exactly what we want. Alright, let's start setting up some of these layers. So let's drag the timeline all the way back to 10 seconds so we are as zoomed out as possible, and let's start positioning this clouds in 3D space. With the cloud background layer selected, hit P to bring up its position, and let's go ahead and put this way far in the back, maybe about 2,000, and hit S to bring up the scale, and let's scale it up to 380 or so. Looks pretty good, and drag this down just a little bit. A couple other things I want to do to this layer. I want to blur it out just a hair because it's a little pixely. It has to do with the low resolution, and I also want to desaturate it. So let's go ahead and take care of those things. With the layer selected, choose Effect, Color Correction, and Tint, which will basically turn it into a black and white image. And the next thing we want to do is grab the blur here and go Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and I'm going to use a Directional Blur. I'm going to set it to 90 degrees and increase the blur length to 5 units, so it just kind of smooths everything out. There we go, that looks pretty good. Next thing, let's put some additional clouds in here. So let's grab the Clouds 02 layer and drag that in on top, make it a 3D layer, and let's bring up the position. I'm going to put the Z position somewhere at about 475 or so. I'm going to drop the opacity here to about 50%, and I'm going to scale this up. That looks good, 235 or so. And I'm going to change the transfer mode from normal to darken here. There we go. Let's just take a look at that. You can see as you scrub through, it just, especially this area, it just shows a little more depth, and there are individual layers here, which is what we want. All right, next thing let's do is duplicate this layer by hitting Control D with it selected, and hit P to bring up its position. And we're going to move this to a little further forward, so maybe 60, and hit R to bring up the rotation. And I'm going to rotate this around the Z-axis, about 180 or pretty close to it. I'm going to change this from a darken mode to an overlay. There we go. And I want to take out some of the contrast here. So with the layer selected, choose Effect, Color Correction, and let's choose Curves. And in the RGB, let's bring this down to about there. Let's bring this up to about the middle. And then let's create a little bit of a curve here. So we'll grab this up, kind of bring this down a little bit. There we go. And if we solo this, you can see what we've done is taken out a lot of the contrast. See how dark it is here? And just kind of made it a little more misty. And then if you scrub through the timeline, you can see it's just, we're just building a 3D effect. So, all right, let's move on to the next cloud layer. Let's grab the Cloud 04 layer and drop that in. Make it a 3D layer. Hit P to bring up position. Leave the position at 0. That looks good. Hit S to bring up the scale, and we'll scale it up. 187 looks pretty good. For this, I think this is kind of pixely too, so let's directional blur that as well. Choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Directional Blur. Set this to 90 degrees or pretty close to it. And let's 3 to kind of smooth this out a bit. Let's change the transfer mode to darken. And let's take the opacity and bring it down to about 67%. And let's scrub through again. There we go. Once again, just more layers of clouds. And let's put it in our final cloud layer here. Grab the Cloud 03 layer. Let's drop that into the timeline. Hit make it a 3D layer. Hit P to bring up its position. And we're going to move this to negative 1040. Looks good. So other thing I want to do is rotate this. So hit the R to bring up the rotation. And let's rotate this in the Z axis to 270. And hit S to bring up the scale and make sure it's scaled up. Change the transfer mode from normal to screen. And let's see how that looks. It looks pretty good, but maybe I bring the opacity of this down just a bit to 80 or so. Nice. All right. Next, let's move on to the text. So, from the menu, choose Composition, New Composition. Let's name this Text. The same settings are just fine. Click OK. Now let's give ourselves a little more room to work here because we're going to have menus pop up here on the side. And choose the Text tool. See what I mean? Here we go. And let's click in the text here. Let's change the text to Harry P. Let's set the size to 200. And let's change a couple of the other settings here. Let's type out our title. We'll go Bessie Holstein. And if you don't know what a Holstein is, there's always Wikipedia. I'm just kidding. It's a type of cow. And let's change some of these settings. I think the text is too wide or too far apart for each other, so we can grab the tracking and bring that in to, let's get it pretty close. Really stylized. -41 looks good. I want to take the B and the H and make them a little bit bigger. So I'm going to stretch them out to about 120 or close to it. but when you stretch them out, it kind of changes where they are. So let's take the baseline shift and move them down 20 pixels or so, so everything lines up a little bit better. That looks good. Okay. And now let's move on to the subtitle. So let's click off here, click again. I'm going to take the size down to about 40, and I'm going to change the font from Harry P to Lumos. And I'm going to turn on the bold and type and take that and put that up here underneath the H, pretty tight. See how that is. We can probably put this back down to 100, put this back to 0, move it down. Looks pretty good. Let's duplicate this layer by hitting Control D and grab it and redo this and move that down to about there. We can probably zoom in here a little bit better to see what we're doing. And okay. Next we'll do half. We'll do this all caps. So turn on caps lock. Half dash Jude. And maybe put that about there. And cud. There we go. Let's zoom back out just a bit. I think I want the half chewed a little further over. So let's move some of these around just a bit. Grab the and layer. Let's move that nice and tight up under here. Grab the layer. That looks good. Grab the half chewed layer. I really want this tight, so let's just grab this and nudge it up and in. Grab the up and in, and then let's grab the cud layer. Bring this up here. Now I think I want to also adjust the size of the initial caps here. So let's go ahead and grab those, and instead of 40, try something like 53 for all of these. And then grab the same thing for the beginning of cud. Maybe move this down. That looks good. There we go. And I'm quite happy with that. All right, so let's give ourselves a little more room. Get rid of these so we can see what we're doing. And let's take that text, and it's in the texture assets right now. Drop it out of there and grab it and put it into a new composition. And we'll rename this text pre-comp. And making sure you're in the text pre-comp, let's go ahead and duplicate that layer. You'll see why in a second. Let's grab the texture and drop it in the middle. And let's see here, hit R to bring up rotate. Let's rotate this around 90 degrees or close to it. And let's move this to where we get a nice, kind of a nice look here. We can even scale it down so we get a little more resolution on it. That looks pretty good. And what we're going to do is change the texture here to an overlay over the gray lettering, and make sure that it is gray lettering. I forgot to tell you that early on. I used RGB value of 114, 114, 114. So anyway, mid-gray, and change the track matte to Luma Matte Text, or actually Alpha Matte Text would be better, and then change the mode on the texture from normal to overlay. Nothing much happened here, but you'll see why we did that in a second. Next thing we want to do is create a nice kind of bevel look to this. So from the menu, select Layer, Layer Styles, Bevel and Emboss, and twirl down the bevel and emboss. Make sure it's inner bevel. Make sure it's inner bevel, and change the technique to Chisel Hard from Smooth. Change the size to 120. And let's zoom in here so you can see what exactly the change is. See how it's nice and beveled here? If we were to turn that off, it's just flat. Adds a lot of dimension to it. Let's change a couple other settings. The angle, it's changed from 120 to about 2, which will shift where the highlight and the shadow are, and change the altitude. Actually, we'll just leave the altitude at 30. That looks pretty good. Let's dial down the highlight to 60, and let's change the shadow to 50. There we go. And I think I want to adjust a little bit of the texture color here. So grab the texture, and let's twirl this down a little bit. Grab Effect, Color Correct, Curves, and let's add a little bit of a contrast curve to this. So brighten up the highlights, pull down the darks, just so kind of everything meshes right over that middle spot again, but just have a little bit of a contrast curve. And let's also kind of colorize this a little bit. So with it still selected, the layer still selected, choose Effect, Color Correction, CC Toner, and let's change the mid-tone from this kind of brown to something a little more tealy. Let's try maybe 44 by 62 by 59. That looks pretty good. Alright, maybe bring this, whoops, grab all these and maybe bring this down just a bit. Okay, go back to the final composition, grab the text pre-comp, drag it in right here, make it a 3D layer, and we need to change the position obviously because we want this to come from behind the camera. So with the layer selected, hit P to bring up the position, and let's change the position from 0 to negative, let's see here, I want it to kind of come in around 3 seconds or so. So let's keep pushing it back into the background. You have 925. Let's see how that looks. That looks pretty good. I don't like the fact that it's, you know, right here and you're coming through it. I want it to be just to the side of it, and it's a little too centered. I want it a little off center, so let's just drag it over just a hair. That's too much. Back. Perfect. There we go. We're almost there. I think it's a little too bright on the outside, so let's go ahead and create a vignette. From the menu, select Layer, New, Solid. We'll call this Vignette. And comp size, any color, doesn't matter. Choose Effect, Generate, Fill. And we're going to fill this with kind of a gray color. So let's grab this and bring it down here. Kind of a lighter gray color. About 191, 191, 191. Let's grab Effect, Generate, Circle. And the way I'm going to do the vignette is use a circle. A lot of times you'll see ovals. I just kind of like the look of a circle with it just being dark on the edges. I think it's a little more filmic. Choose the blending mode to screen. Let's really dial this radius up to something pretty big. 464 looks good. Let's feather this out let's see here, somewhere close to 200 looks good. And let's change the transfer mode to a linear burn. I don't want it affecting the text, so let's go ahead and move the vignette below the text pre-comp, because I want that to be really nice and bright, and if you had the vignette above it, it would darken everything out. So make sure that's below. And I think we really have one kind of final thing to do here in terms of setup, and that's to kind of do an overall color correction. So let's grab a new adjustment layer by choosing Layer, New, Adjustment Layer. And let's add a curves adjustment, effect, color correction, curves. And we're going to go to the red channel, and we're just going to bring down the red channel just a bit to kind of colorize everything. There we go. Kind of a greenish, grayish color. And let's go to the RGB and add just a slight contrast curve here, because we want it to be fairly dark. Alright, I think that looks pretty good. Another thing I want to do though is in the background I want to feel, a little bit of lightning or some action back there. So the way I'm going to do that is to add some exposure adjustments to the background layer. So with the Clouds BG layer selected, we can actually probably even solo it. Choose Effect, Color Correction, Exposure, and we're going to figure out where we want that to happen. And I'm going to kind of key one before the text comes in, and then after the text comes in, a couple more smaller ones. So let's also drag the text in there as a solo, or solo that as well. So you can see where the text comes in. So right about 220, I want like the first little bit of flash of lightning or so. So let's hit a keyframe in the master channel on the exposure, set it at 0. Let's page down 5 times and set the exposure up. Maybe 1 looks good. And then come down and let's see here, we'll drag this back down to 0 and hit U to bring up the keyframes. We can make some more room here and kind of zoom in to see where we are. This should be down at 0. For some reason it's at 1. There we go. And let's lengthen this out. So it kind of flashes, supposed to flash. I don't know what I was doing. There we go. 0, flash, go down. There we go. That's what we wanted. So if we zoom out, we scrub through, we got a flash as it comes in. And then about right here I want another quick flash, so let's set another keyframe, move down a couple frames. We'll set the exposure up to something slightly less. 0.7 looks good. Drag it down again. Back down to 0. A couple frames down. Maybe this time to 0.5. Drag it down. Really let this fade out a little while. Back to 0. And let's just do a quick preview here to see what that looks like with our text. Alright, let's unsolo those and see how that looks with the other things applied. It looks alright, but I think with all those things over top of it, it needs to be brighter. So let's go back in here and kind of change it. That looks a little bit better. We could change the exposure up and this one up, so you can really see it kind of flashing in the background. Alright. Just to add a little polish to the animation, let's add kind of a fade in and a fade out. So let's get another adjustment layer. Choose Layer, New, Adjustment. And let's rename this Fader. And let's grab the exposure effect again, making sure you're on the first frame. Set a stopwatch. Set the exposure down to -10 or so. Move to 1 second. Set that to 0. And then at about 9 seconds or close to it, set another keyframe. So you just hit U, set a keyframe, and then move to 10, and set it back down to, you know, something dark, -10 or close. And let's see, let's select the rest of these and easy ease them. And there we go. All you got to do is add a little, you know, thunder sound effect when these flashes hit. Looks pretty good. As a final touch, if you wanted to add some motion blur to this, you sure can. All you got to do is turn on the motion blur for your 3D layers. The most important one obviously would be the text. So turn it on there and turn it on here. It really doesn't come in that fast, but since it's so close to the camera, you can see it adds just a little bit of softening around the edges, which I think looks quite good. Well, I hope this has been informative and entertaining, and that you can pick up a few tips or tricks in your work. So until next time, this is Michael Park for CreativeCow.net.